Consideration of Commons reasons on the Fire Safety Bill. I will call members to speak in the order listed. As there are counter-propositions to one of the motions, and everything is to be taken in one group, any member in the chamber may speak on this group, subject to usual seating arrangements and the capacity of the chamber. Any intending to do so should email the clerk or indicate when asked. Members not intending to speak should make room for members who do. All speakers will be called by the chair. Short questions of elucidation after the minister's response are discouraged. A member wishing to ask such a question must email the clerk. The grouping is binding. A participant who might wish to press an amendment other than the lead amendment to a division must give notice in debate or by emailing the clerk. Leave should be given to withdraw motions. When putting the question, I will collect voices in the chamber only. If a member taking part remotely wants their voice accounted for if the question is put, they must make this clear when speaking on the group. Lords following proceedings remotely but not speaking may submit their voice, content or not content, to the collection of the voices by emailing the clerk during the debate. Members cannot vote by email. The way to vote will be via the remote voting system. We will now begin. Consideration of Commons reasons on the Fire Safety Bill. Lord Greenhalgh.
My Lords, I beg to move that the Commons reasons be now considered.
The question is that the Commons reasons be now considered. As many of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it. Motion A, Lord Greenhalgh.
My Lords, I beg to move motion A that this House do not insist on its amendments 4B and 4C, to which the Commons have disagreed for their reason 4F. I want to thank noble Lords for engaging in this important debate throughout the passage of the bill. We all share the same concerns about the impact that the cost of remediation is having on many leaseholders and tenants. We all agree that we have to protect leaseholders as far as practicable. All of us in this House agree residents deserve to be safe and feel safe in their homes. I will go on to explain why we consider the proposed amendments in lieu as both inappropriate and unworkable. But first I want to outline in the strongest way possible the importance of this bill and the risk that these remediation amendments are creating. Let us be in no doubt about what is at stake here. We have all agreed throughout the passage of the bill with the fundamental purpose of what we are seeking to achieve. We all want to ensure that there is no legal doubt that under the fire safety order, the responsible person must assess and, as appropriate, identify any of the fire safety risks relating to the external walls and the entrance doors in multi-occupied residential buildings. We also agree that the current legal ambiguity under the fire safety order is unhelpful. If we do not rectify this now with this bill, there will be significant ramifications. If we do not clarify this legal ambiguity, responsible persons can continue to argue that they can lawfully and deliberately ignore the external walls and flat entrance doors in their fire risk assessments. And this inaction will mean important defects will not be identified and be left unremedied, potentially increasing fire safety risks for anyone living in such buildings. Given the agreement repeatedly across both houses that we need to act, then I think we should also all agree that this bill should go onto the statute book in the next few days. The Commons have already voted against two different remediation amendments put forward by your Lordship's House, and by substantial majorities, 115 and 69. Prior to that, the issue of remediation costs was discussed at both Commons Committee and Commons report stage. So, my Lords, the Commons has considered the issue of who pays at 4 different stages and voted on this issue twice, each time supporting the government's view that the provision of this kind is unnecessary. This House has done what is right and proper as a revising chamber, namely to ask the Commons to think again, not once, but twice. It is time for your Lordship's House to respect the will of the elected chamber, to continue to deny the wishes of the democratically elected chamber, particularly where the result of that denial is the increase in fire safety risks, could ultimately cost lives. I want to underline that this government is committed to protecting leaseholders and tenants from the costs of remediation. Hundreds of thousands of leaseholders will be protected from the costs of replacing unsafe cladding on their homes as part of the government's 5-point plan to provide reassurance to homeowners and build confidence in the housing market. The £5.1 billion grant funding made available to leaseholders is unprecedented. We take these issues very seriously and we are acting. To say otherwise is misrepresentative and simply not correct. The government is also taking forward a comprehensive programme of reform to and unfair practice in the leasehold market. From the abolition of ground rents to revising the use of forfeiture. Our plan to alleviate the burden of paying for remediation costs is and should be considered as part of this comprehensive programme. Finally, we recognise that the implementation of the Fire Safety Bill will lead to more remediation issues being identified. But there will be occasions where other measures to mitigate the risk are required rather than extensive remedial works. To suggest that this bill will unleash hundreds of thousands of costs is incorrect. We have always argued that building owners must take a proportionate, risk-based approach that takes into account the possibility of risk to life in properties, which for most leaseholders is mercifully low. This bill applies to all buildings with 2 or more dwellings. The number of buildings that require substantive remedial works is relatively small, as the vast majority of lower-rise buildings will not require the type of remedial work discussed in the House today. If noble lords cast their minds back to the previous stages of the bill, you will find widespread support for clarifying the fire safety order and legislating to implement the Grenfell inquiry recommendations. In fact, the criticism was that we should have introduced sooner and gone faster. It is therefore getting increasingly difficult to square the sentiment of noble lords at the beginning of the passage of the bill with the actions of some peers now. Pointing to 2 examples, whilst I'm grateful to the noble Lord Kennedy of Southwark for his candid engagement with me during the passage of the bill, he tabled amendments at the committee and report stages to, in his words, make progress in respect of the recommendations of the first phase of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. And the noble Lady Baroness Pinnock urged the government at the second reading stage in the House to get on with the process of legislating when she said that she supported the direction of travel the government are taking in relation to this bill, but in her words, the route being taken is too slow. Tabling and voting for these amendments is inconsistent with pressing the government to act quicker. Pushing the fire safety bill back to the other place jeopardises this bill completing its passage before the end of this session. When I last spoke on this bill in this House, I said that this government intends to bring forward regulations to deliver the Grenfell Tower inquiry Phase 1 recommendations before the second anniversary of the inquiry publishing their report. But this is subject to this bill first gaining royal assent. If this bill is not finalised in this session, there will be a delay of potentially a year or more in delivering the inquiry's recommendations. My Lords, I will comment in detail on the amendments in my closing address, but for now I want to leave everyone across this House with 2 key points. Firstly, this government is unreservedly committed to protecting leaseholders from the costs of remediation. We have announced an unprecedented level of funding in this regard and will publish more details as to how this can be accessed. Secondly, do not let this issue prevent the Fire Safety Bill from getting onto the statute book. Pushing this bill back to the other place, this close to the end of the session, risks implementing an important legal clarification that will improve fire safety and help protect lives. I beg to move.
The question is that motion A be agreed to. Lord Bishop of St Albans.
My Lords, I give notice of my intention to seek the opinion of the House when the time comes and declare my interest as a Vice President of the LGA. My Lords, when there's a crisis, we look to Her Majesty's Government for radical and rapid action. Ministers are good at calling stakeholders together around the table. Just yesterday in the other place, the Minister, Oliver Dowden, said he was appalled by the situation. He promised, be in no doubt, if they can't act, we will. We'll put everything on the table to prevent this from happening. Put simply, we will review everything the government does to support them. We will do whatever it takes. Indeed, the situation is so important that it's said that the Prime Minister has decided to rearrange his busy diary and intervene personally to hold a round table to resolve the problem. The trouble is the radical action that's being talked about is about the European Super League, not about the hundreds of thousands of people who at this very moment are facing desperate dilemmas. Now, can I say, I deeply too regret to have to come back. I know this is a nuisance, I know people are fed up, but I have to say it's the first time in my ministry that I've been stopped 3 times in a week on the street by people in St Albans saying, thank you for what you're doing. So I come back hugely reluctantly, and I do want to see this get on the statute book. I really do, and I'm hoping that we can do all we can, if necessary, to sit late to make sure that when it comes back, if it has to come back, it will get on the statute book. I don't want to be holding it up. This is a good bill, one that seeks to implement a recommendation from the Grenfell inquiry. And it's of utmost importance that our dwellings are safe and people can go to sleep at night. However, I do think the consequences of this legislation do have huge impact on leaseholders. The government, and thank you very much, has committed £5 billion. I accept it's unprecedented. It's a wonderful thing, and I want to affirm what the government has done. But as things stand, the grant and the loan scheme that have been promised are not even operational. I was grateful for the Minister. We had 2 meetings in the last week, but it's not even operational. There's no dates. I know they're working as hard and as fast as they can. And there's no assurance, for example, whether there's going to be any ability to apply retrospectively. The moment this bill passes, those who would ordinarily be excluded from paying for replacement cladding under the government scheme could within months be handed very large bills. Likewise, these same bills will be handed to those who should have replacement cladding costs capped at £50 a month under the government scheme. The results of this, I fear, will be bankruptcies, enormous mental health strains, and possibly worse. Part of the problem is that there have been no assurances to prevent the remediation costs being passed on to leaseholders until the government's own scheme is operational. But that's only part of the problem, and this shows the complexity of what we're facing. I don't pretend this is easy, and I don't pretend what I'm proposing is going to solve everything. But, for example, other historic fire safety defects are not covered by this scheme, which still have the potential to bankrupt leaseholders anyway. I remind this House again of the additional financial issues crippling leaseholders, interim fire safety costs, high insurance policies, premiums. Just today I've received an email about a building where the insurance last year was £11,963 and in 1 year has gone up to £242,400 because the insurers believe the building is not safe. Leaseholders are facing bills of around £6,000 each to pay within days. This leaves the leaseholders with a dilemma: sell their lease, take on the debts resulting from negative equity, or stay in these leases and face huge debts in the form of remediation bills, or possibly, in some cases, declare bankruptcy. Surely these leaseholders who went into this The people of aspiration trying to get their place to live, saving for their deposits, could have no indication of this was coming. It's one of these dreadful tragedies. Nobody's pointing the finger at government or anybody like that. One of these dreadful tragedies, they couldn't have foreseen it coming. Now, like the Minister, I agree this fire safety bill is not the ideal place to deal with the issue of remediation costs. But in the absence of an adequate plan or scheme to properly and fairly deal with the issues of remediation and the consequences of this bill, I've simply felt I haven't got any other option. I believe it's my duty as someone here to stand up when we can see this train coming down the track at such huge speed. Without proper protections on leaseholds, the bill will have far-reaching consequences and negatively affect thousands of innocent and inspirational individuals, and I want to do what I can to prevent that happening. Whether my amendment is the best way to deal with this issue remains an open question. I totally admit that. I've tried to put the onus on Her Majesty's Government in this amendment to bring forward their own scheme rather than find a solely legislative solution to this matter. One area I'm unwavering on is the principle underlying this amendment and the need to find an alternative way to approach the issue of remediation costs, as well as all the other costs which are now hitting leaseholders. The Government could have extended their current scheme to cover all historic defects, and delay remediation costs being passed on to leaseholders until it's operational. Leaseholders would still be in an unenviable situation even if this happened, but it would be a vast improvement on the current offer, one that, in my opinion, is not acceptable given the costs these individuals face. However, in the time since this bill was last in the House, nothing has changed. It's why we're left to present broad-stroke solutions to very complex issues. The onus, I've argued, has always been on the Government, in this case, to show leadership in the face of what is so evidently a market failure. I believe this is one of these occasions, not where the Government has to pick up all the bill, but somehow to act as a backstop to enable a solution so that actually these costs can be shared out and solutions can be found. All I would say in conclusion is I hope the Government will take seriously on board what we've said and try to present some sort of way forward to this very real problem. I beg to move.
The question is that motion A1, as an amendment to motion A, be agreed to. My Lords, if motions A1 and A3 were both agreed to, A3 would replace A1. I call the next speaker, the Earl of Lytton.
My Lords, it's a privilege to follow the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, and to speak to motion A2 in my name. And I refer to my vice presidency of the LGA and my professional involvement with property and construction over many years. And I also thank the Minister for keeping his door open for discussion. That has been enormously helpful. Now, this amendment is an attempt to find a way out of what I see as an impasse, which, if not dealt with, may cause unquantifiable financial loss, bankruptcy and hardship. And it's been referred to by the Right Reverend Prelate. And I'm indebted to my local fire and rescue service in West Sussex and the National Fire Chiefs Council for briefing me on the task ahead of them. I think we all do agree they do a fantastic job in keeping us all safe and dealing with risks in a fair and proportionate manner. And I'm indebted to members in another place who have convinced me that the issues I seek to address cannot simply be brushed aside. Now, this is not a challenge to the essential principles of the bill, which I entirely agree are absolutely critical in the light of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. The problem arises because although the bill is short and apparently inoffensive, and from a fire safety standpoint is the necessary action of any government to a post-Grenfell inquiry, its means of implementation have much broader and effectively retroactive results. In amending the existing fire safety order scope, it extends to any building comprising 2 or more residential units. And it doesn't just relate to cladding, but ultimately to a much wider range of fire safety issues and to buildings not previously subject to that safety regime. Now, bear in mind, there are two lead organisations here. The local authority in its housing functions in respect of houses in multiple occupation and student blocks, and the fire and rescue services for some of the other, but more particularly the higher risk and taller buildings. And every time there is a fire in a flatted building, it adds to the malaise. And when one considers that in the wake of the Grenfell fire, a 4-storey block in Worcester Park was destroyed in September 2019, it's clear to me that no government can risk specifying a cut-off point of safe versus unsafe buildings. And I acknowledge that. So as matters stand, many relatively low-rise buildings where risks are considered fewer and without a clear threshold will, for a time, be caught by this, long enough to cause serious problems for a significant number of tenants and leaseholders. And it's this unconstrained exposure to uncertainty and risk and the reaction of the markets to it that have created the problems we now encounter. Crucially, there is a significant gap between now and the time when the first 12,000 in England over 18-metre buildings have been checked, estimated to be completed by December this year. And then there will be a further period until some 68,000 further buildings in the 11 to 18-metre height range have been dealt with. During this period, the issue of proportionality and risk will be left, as I see it, to the febrile mortgage and insurance market. And I have no doubt, indeed would expect, fire safety inspectors to take a fairly strict approach, at any rate until further guidance is available, which guidance itself may be an outcome of the analysis of the first tranche inspections of the highest risk buildings. So that delay occurs before one gets to design and specification of the remediation works by those who may have to satisfy their own professional PI conditions, professional indemnity conditions, followed then by tendering and ultimately remediation. Now, the Right Reverend Prelate and the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock in her amendment endeavour to protect the tenant and leaseholder from the effects of the bill by saying that they shall not bear the financial burden. I am compelled to express the view that this needs to be taken further. For if as a result the building owner as freeholder is made liable for something that it in turn cannot afford or cannot be made responsible for beyond the assets of whatever corporate ownership vehicle holds the freeholder or other superior interest, then the liquidation of the holding company and the vesting of the negative value asset in the hands of insolvency practitioners will do little to get the building remediated. To that extent, the responsible person under the bill may be a man of straw, and that I see as a weakness in what the government proposes. To deal with this, one needs a scheme, and the government has commendably said it will introduce one to fund the remediation, but this suffers from several limitations. Firstly, it only applies to cladding. Secondly, it doesn't cover all buildings with claddings, even less the other fire safety issues that the bill may also trigger. Thirdly, I very much doubt if the sum allocated is enough, but that said, I'm extremely grateful for the government commitment to making £5 billion funding available, as the Minister has explained. Apart from properties becoming unsaleable, uninsurable and unsuitable for mortgage lending, in some cases they may well be so risky as to be declared unsafe for occupation pending remediation works. Displaced occupiers will be wondering what it is on the principle of safety and proportionality in relation to their own home, and the nightmare imposition of unimaginable cost liabilities that justifies rendering them homeless in addition. Of course, it may well not come to that, and it is my purpose to encourage the government to ensure that there is a scheme to make certain it does not. But the full extent of the problems may still be yet to come, which I strongly suspect many of the responsible persons holding on until this bill receives royal assent before proceeding further. Now, my lords, no government can simply look on and say it isn't an issue of a very serious kind when people who have been seriously threatened in their own homes by negative equity, bankruptcy and worse. And with an entire market section being blighted, action is essential. And by the same token, No agency apart from government has the power to procure a change, which ultimately must be by some form of consensus, but requires regulatory and other powers, or the threat of them, and a degree of arm twisting involving some very powerful players. There are too many interests and moving parts here, and neither constructors, owners, leaseholders, tenants, insurers, or mortgagees can procure effective solutions on their own. It is a systemic failure which is right for government, in which it is right for government to intervene, and indeed taking these hard decisions is why we have government intervention at all. But by the same token, if there is to be a government safety net of a type that is effective, no leaseholder can simply expect the taxpayer to foot the bill for all and every fire safety shortcoming. And this is where, in particular in relation to the motion in the name of the noble Baroness Lady Pinnock, I differ from that approach. And I do not suggest that any of this gets construction warranty providers, approved inspectors, designers, constructors, house buildings, or building managers off the hook. It will take time to establish liabilities. It is time that those finding themselves in financial fetters do not have at their disposal. And that is the problem. So absolutism by government on the one hand, by leaseholders alike, will not get the necessary work done or erase the terrible personal tragedies that I fear will result. So the deal is this. For a monthly sum, which should be affordable, even if most unwelcome, the capital cost of remediation could be amortized via a loan and funds for early inspection and remediation raised and works put in hand as soon as possible. This might also fund short-term interim safety measures. The long-term bonds so created would, I believe, be saleable. The important thing for effective householders and flat owners is that they could not be charged until a scheme is in place. But the scheme has to be driven initially by government, and that is what this amendment is about. The current government scheme seems to be based on rolling things out in due course. I appreciate the Minister's point that he does not wish the government to be unduly pressurised and under the cosh in this. But there is the need to get this safety net in place right now is, I believe, overwhelming. By the end of this coming summer, impossibly large bills are likely to have almost certainly to have dropped onto doormats. Prohibition notices and evacuation orders may be in place, and bankruptcies grown to a national scandal. I hope we avoid this, but I, for one, simply cannot stand by and let that happen unchallenged or by default. And I realise it goes against what some have been asking for, but what is better, to know you are innocent but your home remains unsaleable and you risk being put in an impossible financial position or rendered homeless, or to know that there is at least some means of funding the remediation so that in the event at least that some benefit is salvaged out of this debacle. And I know also it goes against the grain of government to interfere with private legal arrangements and liabilities. But the circumstances, I believe, are truly exceptional, and the scope of the works relatively specific, and the alternative is a high level of sector-wide economic damage and individual financial construction. Now, I know that the Minister is not minded to accept any of the arguments that I've put forward or my solutions. And I make it clear that I do not intend to press this, this motion. It is my wish to get further explanations from the Minister. But my questions are these. Well, if not this amendment and scheme, then what? And if not in this bill, which triggers it, or even the building safety bill, then how? And if not now, with the ill effects so apparent and very likely worse to come, when? And further, if not by government, then by whom and which agency? If the objection to broadening things, as I suggest, comes from HM Treasury, I would ask whether the government has considered the political and economic enormity of the outcomes if this problem is not addressed now. To that end, can the House be advised what impact assessment has been made of the wholesale value write-offs and the risk of sectoral market collapse? And finally, if the Minister feels my concerns are misplaced and things are not as bad as I have suggested they might be, surely then the risk of exposure of the taxpayer is of itself a stopgap a confidence building measure rather than a serious run on the exchequer. All areas of activity carry some risks which are considered acceptable, and indeed there's no zero risk existence to be had anywhere. We allow vintage bangers on our roads, service conduits that are more than 100 years old, permit antique furniture containing horsehair from possibly from anthrax infected animals, cherish Tudor box frame houses with no foundations to speak of, accept asbestos in buildings according to practical risk, and occupy a Parliament building that is a known hazard in waiting. Total risk aversion is not a viable way forward, but this bill, having raised the bar, now needs to be accompanied by safety nets, backstops and proportionality in what follows, and they must be put in place forthwith. Or parliamentarians will be faced with questions as to how it is that the danger from fire has become the factor that puts families at serious peril, if not actually out of their homes. And these are hard decisions which cannot be avoided, and they are ones which any government must address. Thank you.
Call Baroness Pinnock.
My Lords, I draw the attention of the House to my relevant interests as a Vice President of the Local Government Association and as a member of Kirklees Council. This has so far been a very good debate, with both the Noble Earl Lytton using his expertise to detail the problems and suggest solutions, but the problems that, as he says, have yet to be resolved and need to be resolved. And then the noble prelate, the Bishop of St. Albans, for his passionate expose of the real difficulties facing individuals in this position. My Lord, we know that a property purchase is the largest single financial commitment that the majority of us ever make. Yet the guarantees, the warranties, and even building insurance for leaseholders fail to provide anything approaching adequate provision for those who find themselves living in a home where building regulations have been openly and plainly breached. Those living through this construction crisis and cladding scandal, exposed by the awful tragedy of Grenfell, are left with nowhere to find redress for the inexcusable failings of the construction companies. This is in stark contrast with manufacturers of, for example, cars and white goods, where faults are discovered even when the goods are out of warranty. The manufacturers call them in and make the repairs at their expense. What a difference with the construction industry, where only some of those involved have made any provision for remediation works, and this is the bare minimum they feel they can get away with. The total estimated cost of remediation so far is £16 billion. The government are expecting construction companies to pay £200 million a year towards the remediation costs. With the government-funded scheme, that leaves a full £9 billion to fall on those who throughout are the innocent victims. The purpose of both the amendments in my name and that of the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St. Albans, is to extend the principle already agreed by the government. That is, that this serious problem can only be successfully fixed with upfront funding from the government, which can then be recouped from developers, construction firms, and manufacturers. Throughout this debate, I have sought to draw the attention of the House to the very real and serious consequences on the individual leaseholders and tenants. There is Alison, who has recently had a bill for £28,000. That is just her share of the costs of putting right the construction errors in her block. This isn't for cladding removal. The other construction failings are not covered by the scheme that the government have introduced, but still have to be remedied. How is that bill to be paid? She carefully budgeted for the costs of her mortgage and the service charges. She has no means of raising the finance needed. Where on earth can she turn to save her home? Another flat owner has written to me, as they have apparently to the noble prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, about the further consequences of the scandal. And they write and tell me about their buildings insurance premium. And it is so shocking that I think it is worth sharing again. The insurance premium for their block was just £11,963 this year. I beg your pardon, last year. And that has rocketed to £242,400. How on earth can people living in that block of flats have budgeted for that sort of exponential rise in insurance premiums? And further, how on earth can they have budgeted or indeed find any finance to pay the bill that they expect within a week of £6,000 for each and every one of them? Without the government doing what governments can and should do, which is to protect individuals from situations where they are the innocent victims. As a consequence of a complete lack of effective government action, bankruptcy has been the only route out of this scandal for many already. Others are on the brink of choosing that as the only option left. Yet these are the very people who have done everything right and nothing wrong. Some are even those who have been supported by the government through the Help to Buy offer. And what are the options after bankruptcy, when everything you have worked for has been taken away? For those without dependents, the situation is very difficult. They become homeless, and homeless through no fault of their own. It cannot be right that the government is allowing this to happen. Now, I do not envy the task of the noble Lord the Minister today, as he seeks to defend the indefensible. I feel sure he will point to the Building Safety Bill as the cure-all for the failings of the construction sector. But my lords, the Building Safety Bill has yet to start its deliberations. Its potential remedies will come far too late for those caught up in this crisis. The noble Lord the Minister has argued that the Fire Safety Bill will fall if agreement is not reached. The Minister argues the need to act. What he fails to then say is at what cost? At whose cost? I thank the Minister for reminding me of my words at second reading. The Minister has been a bit selective. I've always said throughout the passage of this bill that leaseholders must not be asked to pay. The Fire Safety Bill is, yes, something that across the House we support. But equally, the consequences of it need to be thought through as well. Unfortunately, the government is constantly stating that it is helping leaseholders, and the noble Lord the Minister has repeated that today. But he fails then to say that this is unfortunately at a minimal level, and the extent of the help is not adequate. I have asked the cladding groups for their view on whether or not they would suffer if the Fire Safety Bill fell, and their view was unanimous. They conclude they will be no worse off if it does fall, and to some extent, they say, if the bill does not pass, it provides them with precious time to get the issue properly addressed. Yesterday, the government announced that it will change the law to refund investors in the London and Capital Finance mini bond scheme. The government has accepted that the FCA failed to regulate the firm properly. The similarities with this construction scandal are many. Innocent victims set to lose out due to the failure of regulatory control. However, in the case of the cladding scandal, it is innocent victims set to lose everything they own and have worked hard for. This is not right. The amendment in my name seeks to put this awful wrong right and to establish the roll call of statistics of bankruptcy, homelessness, mental ill health and worse, relationships broken and careers lost. Hundreds of thousands of individuals and families are watching and waiting for the decision of this House today. They are willing us on to help find a fair and just solution to a problem that is not in any way of their making. Yet they are the ones who are being asked to pay the price. My lords, if the noble prelate, the Bishop of St. Albans, wishes to divide the House, then the Liberal Democrat benches will fully support him. If, however, he chooses not to do so, then I will wish to test the opinion of the House.
My Lords, the following members in the Chamber have indicated that they wish to speak. Baroness Fox of Buckley, Lord Newby, Baroness Warwick of Undercliff, Lord Adonis and Lord Cormac. I will call them in that order. So first, Baroness Fox of Buckley.
My Lords, it's with some reluctance that I've decided to speak in support of these amendments, especially at this late stage of the bill. I don't want to unnecessarily delay legislation that aims to make homes safer, and I'm very, very sensitive about the dangers of undemocratic overreach and defying an elected chamber. But I speak because there's an urgent risk that rather than this well-intentioned, important bill being remembered as a law that will save lives by tackling the fire safety defects at the heart of the Grenfell tragedy, instead, if passed unamended, it will become known as the bill that ruins lives, making tens of thousands bankrupt, homeless, their homes transformed from places of safety to sites of anxiety, stress and penury. I've not spoken on the bill before, but have followed the debates carefully, and I've heard eloquent, passionate, evidence-based and constructive interventions from noble lords on all sides of the House, patiently explaining to the government how this bill, unintentionally no doubt, has weaponised fire safety measures and targeted not developers or freeholders or cladding manufacturers or builders, but the most blameless constituents in all of this, leaseholding homeowners, to horrendous, mind-boggling amounts of money to pay the remediation costs or defects to cover defects to make homes safe when they purchased their flats in good faith. I assume that the government were listening and that they understood after all this, and they've given lots of public assurances, ministers both here and elsewhere, that leaseholders wouldn't become the fall guys, and I believe them. And I was pleased to welcome the £5 billion long-term loan schemes, the £50 a month cap and, on repayments. This reassured me. But I'm speaking today in desperation because I'm utterly shocked to discover that this government scheme is not yet operational, that there's no date available for when it will be. And yet the very moment this bill becomes force, if unamended, leaseholders will be landed with even more astronomical bills and with demands that they're paid within days, within weeks. and that is on top of the immiseration already occurring caused by interim costs. And the government won't even clarify if they will allow retrospective acquisition to the scheme to those who have already been handed extortionate bills to date, or the debts being accrued for historic health and safety defects. This just feels particularly mean-spirited and, if I can say so, tone-deaf. It just seems to me that we're being urged to fast-track the bill, that actually the government might fast-track the scheme. Because this discussion is actually about more than money, it's about moral leadership. If the Grenfell tragedy has revealed institutional failures at multiple levels, and it's revealed a failure by those in authority to listen to the warnings of tenants, those on the ground concerns were contemptuously dismissed, as we know. This leaseholder tragedy feels similarly related to institutional intransigence, box-ticking safety without nuance. And it also is an example, or it seems to be, of a refusal to listen to the voices of leaseholders and their advocates here and in the other place, who are pleading with you to hear their warnings of the disastrous consequences for homeowners if this legislation is passed unamended. My Lords, I should declare an interest. I am a leaseholder of a local authority maisonette in Haringey. My block of flats had a serious fire in the middle of the first lockdown. Thank God no one was hurt, but 22 families were evacuated. The fire ripped through the roof, our possessions and homes were ruined by extensive water damage and smoke. 1 year on, we leaseholders are still effectively homeless. We've been told that we won't be returning home until spring 2022, 2 years after the fire. To be honest, it's been heartbreaking, but I'm not here for your sympathy, but to tell you that one of the worst aspects of the whole experience has been that despite lots of emails and phone calls, queries to the leaseholders team at the council go unanswered. The main communications we have had from the council have been demands for council tax and service charges, even though my temporary accommodation is not in Haringey. So while I'm not an expert in fire safety, I do have some insider knowledge about how it feels to be ignored and treated shoddily as a leaseholder. But, my Lords, I know I'm very privileged, and also that I'm very lucky that I'm not facing the problems my fellow leaseholders now have in terms of the cladding issue. But can we just remember who these leaseholders are, because they are friends and colleagues of mine. They're predominantly not wealthy. They're often people who can only get on the housing ladder by becoming a leaseholder, as I did 20 years ago. 56% of these leaseholders are first-time buyers, the very people the government are so keen to encourage and commended for doing so. The stories of leaseholders trapped and crippled by building safety debt are devastating. For example, those in Waterside Park who are now paying £650 a month for waking watch patrols alone. And who lives at Waterside Park? Many are key workers, pandemic frontline workers in East London earning less than £2,000 a month, and they now face additionally remediation costs estimated at £75,000. Or can you imagine being those hard-working householders in Brindley House in Birmingham whose service charges have risen from £1,300 a year in 2017 to £4,550 today, and whose remediation costs are £45,000 for one-bedroom flat, £78,729 for a two-bedroom property? I was particularly moved by the letter from a vicar and his wife about the plight of their 30-year-old son and his wife and 2-year-old disabled grandchild. That son earns less than £25,000 a year, and so he signed up for the government's Help to Buy scheme, and his parents drew significantly on their pension to help him. And now this young man and his family face homelessness, hopelessness through no fault of their own. His desperate parents, in writing, ask who will take moral responsibility for what they call life-changing financial and emotional catastrophe. And they say, and the Minister might be interested, we as previously Conservative voters feel betrayed by this government who have, after all, promoted home ownership. And indeed the government has, and I commend them for it. Only yesterday the Conservative Party put out this advert to quote, "Today," the government says, "we launch our scheme to back 95% mortgages helping first-time buyers and home buyers, turning generation rent into generation buy. So why then today would we pass this piece of legislation unamended, which is going to turn generation leaseholder into generation bankrupt? My lords, I really commend the Right Reverend Prelate Bishop of St Albans, the noble Lord Lytton, Lytton and the noble Lady Pinnock for their perseverance in pushing this, because I don't think they're well-known troublemakers or going out of their way to be sectarian. It's because this matters. The amendments don't solve every problem, and leaseholders will still shoulder ongoing interim safety costs, but at least it eases some of the financial burden. But also it gives the government some breathing space to resolve the myriad other challenges without ruining people. No one here pretends these issues are easy to solve. Costs are spiralling. Even the government's estimated remedial costs of £9,000 per leaseholder looks naive when the real figures of tens of thousands are the reality. And sadly, any new regulation creates new layers of bureaucracy. There are consultants all over this. And then there's the risk aversion leading to sky-high insurance premiums, a reluctance to sign off EWS1 forms and lenders' reluctance to accept them. So I know that there's a lot to tackle. But I want to say to the government, you aren't alone. This is not a blame game or indeed a party political issue. This is a case, maybe, of market failure unintended, and it requires the sort of collective, state-backed intervention that we've seen from this government with issues like furlough. It needs a bailout or a safety net, and the governments are more than capable of doing that. And the government has allies here in terms of coming up with creative solutions. Here and in the other place, you've heard some fantastic ideas, ways of solving this. And if you talk to the rank and file leaseholder groups, they are full of innovative policies that can solve this. But to access those ideas, the government has to talk to people and to listen. I do hope that the noble Lord Minister listens today and accepts this amendment, because actually I know you mean well, but you're not doing well.
The next speaker is Lord Newby.
I begin by declaring my interest as a leaseholder in a block of flats which faces major fire remediation works. My Lords, when we last debated this bill, I teased the Minister by suggesting that he was behaving like Sir Humphrey in the TV series Yes Minister by coming up with a series of bureaucratic reasons for not taking any action. After the debate, I was a bit worried that I might have been a bit unfair to him, so I reread his speech just to make sure. My Lords, I fear that, if anything, I'd underestimated the extent to which the government was indeed hiding behind stock bureaucratic arguments for not doing what it knows is now required to clear up the scandal. And he's repeated some of those arguments today. The Minister last time round, as he has today, accepted that something more was needed. Last time he said, "It is unacceptable for leaseholders to have to worry about the cost of fixing historic building safety defects." He also acknowledged that the government believed that, and I quote, "building owners and industry should make buildings safe without passing on costs to leaseholders." So far, so good. But when it came to actually dealing with removing that worry, the Minister's response to the amendments from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Albans, and my noble friend Baroness Pinnock, the Minister at great length and somewhat repetitiously explained why the government had no plans to fix the problem. The reasons were as follows. First, it would be impractical and confusing to include remediation measures in the bill. Well, it wouldn't be confusing if they were clear. Second, it was too soon to include comprehensive measures in the bill. It was, the Minister said, important to ensure that the practical implications of any legislation are properly worked through rather than being rushed. Well, we wouldn't want the government to rush to solve the problems of people who are being forced into bankruptcy today, would we? Third, the amendment was too narrow. Too narrow. It does not, said the Minister, take into account remedial work that arises beyond the fire assessment processes, and it will go beyond focusing on service charges. Fourth, it wasn't detailed enough and would require, and I quote, extensive drafting of primary legislation. Not that this government or any other government fails to know how to draft extensively. Look at the length of the statute book. Fifth, it would delay the implementation of the bill, which would be highly regrettable. And the Minister has spoken at great length about the costs of delay today. But as my noble colleague Baroness Pinnock has pointed out, this would be highly regrettable to the government, but not highly regrettable to people who are going bankrupt, because the bill does nothing for them. Sixth, loose drafting would lead to litigation. How terrible. Seventh, the amendments didn't reflect the complexity involved in apportioning liability for remedial defects. Well, perhaps the amendments didn't, but in my experience, owners of blocks of flats are pretty good when it comes to apportioning liability for costs, because we somehow seem to get that job done every year when we get our service charges. And finally, it would be self-defeating, as landlords could simply decide to walk away. My Lords, Sir Humphrey would have been very proud of the Minister's performance. But leaseholders, listening to his arguments, will have realised that they amounted to one depressing fact. The government wasn't prepared to fashion a legislative response which dealt with their legitimate concerns. It was, in effect, simply saying that it would like to resolve the matter, but it was too difficult. And there was no willingness on the part of the Minister to commission civil servants to do the work necessary to find a workable solution. Some 3.75 years after Grenfell, the government's completely failing to relieve leaseholders of their concerns and failing to find a way of requiring building owners and contractors to make buildings safe without passing on the costs. My Lords, the amendments before us today are yet a further attempt to move the government towards meeting what it says are its desired outcomes. It's shown no will to do so on its own volition. It therefore falls to your Lordship's House to insist again that it does the right and decent thing.
I now call Baroness Warwick of Undercliff.
My Lords, I declare an interest as Chair of the National Housing Federation, the representative body for housing associations in England. The fact that these issues are before the House again demonstrates the enormous concern that blameless leaseholders should be protected from suffering the costs of those building safety remediation works which have come to light since the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower almost 4 years ago. And I pay tribute, like others, to the commitment and tenacity of the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, the noble Earl, Lord Lytton, and the noble Baroness Lady Pinnock for keeping the government's feet to the fire. Housing associations have worked tirelessly since 2017 to uncover and put right the urgent building safety issues with which, since the Grenfell tragedy, we're now all too familiar. The safety of their residents is an absolute and immovable priority for the housing association sector. They're also acutely aware of the stress and heartache leaseholders have been experiencing and have been pursuing every avenue available to them to ensure those responsible, the developers of these buildings, pay for their mistakes. The funds the government has already made available for building safety works have a very important part to play in tackling this crisis, but it's by no means a complete solution. It's just not acceptable that under the established scheme, some costs will still fall to leaseholders. I've said before, my Lords, in early discussions on the bill, and I stress again today, that social housing providers cannot access this funding for remedial works on properties where tenants live. The funding only applies to leaseholders. That means quite simply that these charitable organisations, which don't make a profit and are set up with the primary purpose of housing people on lower incomes, are facing an enormous bill to set right errors not of their own making, a bill that, at a modest estimate, will exceed £10 billion. I hope the Minister will agree that over the last year, housing associations have played a vital role in communities up and down the country, excuse me, They have been at the forefront of both the local and national response to the coronavirus pandemic. Not only have they provided safe and secure homes to their residents at a time when home has never been more important to us, but they've also delivered services that have helped keep people's heads above water over the course of these most harrowing months. And their roles as community anchors will be ever more important in the months and years to come, because many of their residents are likely to suffer the social and economic fallout from the pandemic. On top of this, the housing association sector is central to our efforts to beat the country's housing crisis and to meeting our net zero ambitions. They're the driving force behind building thousands of new sustainable homes each year, as well as making existing properties greener. Bluntly, my lords, this work will be far, far harder to deliver if there isn't the funding to cover building safety costs. Safety must be a top priority, so resources will have to be diverted away from improving residents' properties, providing community services, building new homes and tackling the climate crisis. So can the Minister please tell the House what assessment his department has made of the impact that the remediation costs for tenanted properties will have on the wider work of the housing association sector? My lords, manufacturers, developments and those responsible for building these properties created this crisis, and they should pick up the bill. It's clear that there is a huge amount of support from members of the other place for this to happen, but that will take work and some time to achieve. The only logical, immediate answer to this intractable problem is for government to provide upfront funding for all remedial works and then to recoup later the cost to the taxpayer by establishing developers' liabilities. So can I urge the Minister today to confirm that the government will move to protect leaseholders, social housing tenants and social housing providers by making funding available up front for this essential work to be done?
I now call Lord Adonis.
My Lords, the Bishop of St Albans will have heard the strong support across the House for his amendment. He indicated at the beginning of his remarks that he intends to press this matter, and I would strongly encourage him to do so, and it looks to me as if he'll have a commanding majority across the House. The speech of the Minister, though, my Lords, was very odd. Indeed, it was so odd that I can't think that the noble Lord Greenhow actually wrote his own speech. I think it must have been written by some political advisor in his department who just put a set of remarks together that he thought would basically tell the House of Lords to get lost, which was basically the gravamen of his argument, hoping that we would then somehow think that the third time round we wouldn't press this and even get into the arguments. Because what he said, my Lords, and I noted it down very carefully, is that what was being proposed here was inappropriate and unworkable, he said. I was waiting for him to describe to the House how the amendment in the name of the Bishop of St Albans was inappropriate and unworkable, but he didn't. He said that he wouldn't comment in detail at the beginning, he would comment in detail at the end. Well, my Lords, that wasn't much use to us, because the debate takes place before his remarks, not after. We have no means of replying to him after. So that argument is clearly of no account whatsoever, unless he is has such compelling arguments against the Bishop of St Albans that on hearing them, we would be completely silenced. However, my Lords, when one reads the amendment of the Bishop of St Albans, it is impossible to see how it could be described as inappropriate and unworkable, because what the Right Reverend Prelate is proposing is, firstly, that costs may not be passed on to leaseholders or tenants, an argument in its absolute state, which the Minister has objected to, and I understand his arguments for it. But the crucial part of the Right Reverend Prelate's amendment is part 2. This section has effect only until a statutory scheme is in operation, which ensures that leaseholders and tenants of dwellings do not have to pay for remedial work attributable to provisions of this Act. My Lords, what is inappropriate and unworkable about that? What the Right Reverend Prelate is proposing is simply that the government's own scheme, which one assumes is not going to be inappropriate and unworkable, must be before Parliament and be subject to consideration before people are faced with costs. Unless I've missed something in the arguments here, the Bishop is agreeing and the Minister hasn't said anything to the contrary. So, my Lords, by definition, it can't be inappropriate and unworkable because we're talking about the government's own scheme. All that the Right Reverend Prelate is seeking to do, which is an absolute role for a revising chamber to insist upon, is that leaseholders should not be subject to these costs, which could be bankrupting and cause them enormous distress, maybe simply unmanageable, until there is a scheme. That the scheme must be presented and have been agreed before they face these costs. My Lords, we've heard harrowing stories from people with individual and personal cases at stake, but also, as the Bishop so rightly says, potentially, because we're not quite sure what the numbers are, but potentially hundreds of thousands of people who are affected by this, as to the impact it's going to have. It's not unreasonable, my Lords, for this House to insist that before they are faced with those costs, we know what the scheme is and it's been subject to proper consideration. And, my Lords, what makes it even odder is that the government itself says that this is its intention. When the matter last came before the House of Commons, the Minister responsible, Christopher Pincher, said, and I quote, "We have been working hard," he said, "we have been working hard to ensure that those with broad shoulders and those that should pay do pay," which is precisely the principle that we're all seeking to establish. That is why my Right Honourable friend the Chancellor announced at the budget that there will be a levy on tall buildings and a tax on the sector. We do not want to absolve the industry of its responsibility. We are, and these I'm continuing to quote from the words of the Minister, Chapman Pincher, we are finalising how they will be calculated, and the Treasury is leading on the development of the tax. Of course, we want to ensure that it works effectively and that small and medium developers are not unfairly disadvantaged. We want to get it right and we want to get it done as quickly as we can. We will, I'm continuing to quote the Minister, we will bring forward as soon as we possibly can the workings of the financial support scheme that we announced at the budget that will ensure that leaseholders and buildings below 18 metres pay no more than £50 a month. My Lords, those commitments and statements on the part of the Minister are completely consistent with the proposal put forward by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, which simply says that the scheme must be ready, approved and operable before leaseholders pay any costs. So, my Lords, the substantive argument that the Minister made, that the Bishop of St Albans' proposal is inappropriate and unworkable, is clearly nonsensical and wrong. The other argument that he used was that we were somehow delaying matters, my Lords. Well, the House of Commons last debated this issue on Monday, the 22nd of March. The date today is the 20th of April. My Lords, that is a month. The reason for the delay in considering this bill has nothing to do with your Lordships, nothing to do with the leaseholders, nothing to do with the Bishop of St Albans, and everything to do with the government. And indeed, my Lords, on the same day that the House of Commons considered our amendments to the Fire Safety Bill, they also considered our amendments to the Trade Bill. Now, those of your Lordships who multitask, and there are some of us who do more than one bill at a time, will know that the amendments to the Trade Bill were dealt with in your Lordship's House afterwards, within a matter of days after. I think it was 3 or 4 days after. We were still in the 20-something of March when they were dealt with. The reason why we are not considering this matter until the 20th of April and very close to the end of the session has nothing whatsoever to do with your Lordships and everything to do with the government. Now, my Lords, we still have a period of time between now and the end of the session. As the Bishop so rightly said, if the Prime Minister can spring into such dramatic action in response to developments in the Football League, he could certainly, and the government can certainly get its act together to consider and put forward proper proposals in respect of a scheme. Or, much more pertinently, my Lords, if they say that the full resources of the government in terms of drafting and all that aren't available because the parliamentary draftsmen are presumably on holiday or whatever, so they can't do it. I mean, the noble Lord Newby could read out more, yes, Minister, excerpts from this. All he needs to do, which is what we're urging him to do, is to accept the Bishop of St Albans' amendment that gives him the time to do it, because its key provision is that leaseholders will not be faced with these charges until the statutory scheme is in operation, so he has the time that he needs. But, my Lord, it's not just the case that the reason for the delay is the government and not this House. We are dealing with a situation, my Lords, which is nearly 4 years old. It's not as if somehow Grenfell happened a few months ago. We're still trying to estimate what the impacts were, and we're being rushed into legislation and the design of a scheme. My Lords, 4 years! 4 years! And a whole public inquiry, the first stage of which has already reported. Again, the reason for the delay in this respect has nothing to do with the leaseholders, nothing to do with this House, and everything to do with the government. So, my Lords, the Special Advisor who wrote the Minister's speech, what were they actually seeking to do? I think it's pretty clear, because most of us here are seasoned politicians. What they were seeking to do was to see that the fire safety bill becomes law before the impact on the leaseholders is known fully. My Lords, we need to get to the heart of this matter as to what is happening here. Obviously, in response to this urgent and compelling safety crisis that we face, there had to be changes in the safety regulations, more precisely to see that the existing safety regulations were actually enforced, which is what we're really talking about, is the fundamental point of principle here. But what the government does not want is for leaseholders who may face large bills, potentially tens of thousands of pounds, and who may, in many cases, not be covered by the schemes which are only in outline at the moment, in outline in their description. It doesn't want them to be faced with those costs or any knowledge of what they might be before this bill becomes law. But, my Lords, that is all the more reason why Parliament should not be prepared to play the government's game, because this is not a political game or a script of Yes Minister. These are hundreds of thousands of people's lives who face bills of tens of thousands of pounds, and it is perfectly reasonable that this House and the House of Commons should at least have given their assent to and know what the schemes are in respect to which they're going to have to pay these sums before they become law. So, my Lords, when the Minister said that the Bishop of St Albans' proposal is inappropriate and unworkable, there is nothing inappropriate and unworkable whatsoever about ensuring that a statutory scheme must be in operation before leaseholders face bills which could, as I say, run into tens of thousands of pounds. And the only reason for the delay in the past and now is because of the government. And this could all be sorted out in the next few days before the end of this session if there was a will to move. And for that reason, my Lords, I strongly urge the Bishop of St Albans, on behalf of hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens who have a right to expect fair play from Parliament, I strongly urge him to press this amendment to a vote.
The next speaker is Lord Cormack.
My Lords, having heard so much this afternoon, I do not think that I really wish to add to the powerful arguments that have been advanced.
In that case, Lord Kennedy of Southwark will speak.
My Lords, firstly I draw the attention of the House to my relevant interests as a Vice President of the Local Government Association, a non-executive director at MHS Homes Limited, and chair of the Hart and Medway Housing Association. It is most disappointing that we're back here again. And we're back here again because the government neither listened nor recognised the plight of the people trapped in their homes. And for me, that is extremely disappointing. I mean, I've spoken to a number of the victims, and they are innocent victims over recent weeks. And you think of the stress, the worry, the concern, the costs, lives on hold, and for many, no end in sight. And it is not good enough, and we must alter the place to think again on this issue. We must stand with the innocent victims, the leaseholders and the tenants. It is a scandal, a disgraceful, monumental scandal, and the government cannot be let off the hook today. We hear lots about levelling up from the government. Well, it's one of their new phrases we've heard over the last year, levelling up. What about some levelling up for the victims of the cladding scandal? That's what I think we need to hear today. You buy your home, often your first home. You pay your mortgage. You pay your taxes. You play by the rules. You do the right thing. You're a good citizen. And what you want is your government to stand with you, to be by your side, to stand up for you, and to make those responsible for this scandal put it right. That's what they want today. Put those responsible, not the innocent victims, to put this right. Be that the companies who built these defective properties, the people who signed the buildings off as safe when they're not safe, those who provided the guarantees, the insurance guarantees, that if anything went wrong, they would put them right. And that's why we on these benches very much support Amendment A1 in the name of the Right Reverend Prelate, and we're in the lobbies with him when he hopefully divides the House. For me, it's clear, it's simple, it's effective, and it is time limited. And if the word that a government means anything, then they should be supporting this amendment also. The motion prevents the owner of a building from passing on any costs or remedial work, and it remains in force. As the point my Lord Lorna said, it remains in force only until we have the statutory scheme in place, which of course then will deal with the issue of costs and deal with the scandal. It will provide welcome relief. It will provide respite. It will show that there is a way out of this nightmare. It will show the government are actually with the victims of this scandal, actually with the victims, and they are the innocent people here. Now, the weakness for me of the government's position is highlighted in their own position, which I think is utterly ridiculous. The government controls the other place. They've got a majority of 80. We've heard they've held this up for a month. They could have discussed it weeks ago, discussed it in this House. And now they tell us, oh, if we carry on, the bill's at risk. That is just not acceptable. That's just not good enough. The only way this bill falls is if the government choose to let it fall and do nothing about that. And the hold-up is purely caused by the Prime Minister, by the government, just decide they just do not want to go here. And that's what the problem is. Like the Right Reverend Prelate, I was also pleased to hear about the urgent action the government were taking, the summit at number 10, the calls that it would not happen, the demands for urgent action. But of course, as the Right Reverend Prelate said, it was about the European Super League. Well, if we could have a summit for the Super League, why can't we get a summit for the insurance companies into number 10 and say, what are you doing this week? Why can't there be a summit for the building companies this week in number 10? Why can't there be a summit for the victims in number 10 this week? Because apparently, if it's the Super League, everyone can come in straight away. It is just not good enough, my lords. So I think that we need these summits. We need the government to actually act and actually stand by victims. It is just not good enough. Because surely if the fate of Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United and Tottenham Hotspur are a matter of the gravest concern for number 10, then surely the victims should be a matter of gravest concern for number 10 as well. It's just not good enough. And I do hope that we'll go back to the Prime Minister and tell him how angry this House is where we find us today. I thought that the Noble Lord Newby powerfully set out with the government's failing to do this and how wrong they are. And there is no good reason for acting today, no reason at all. And the government should actually be supporting this amendment, because I do think it is a really well-drafted amendment and actually takes us forwards. And the government have made pledges, they've made promises to the victims, and they're going to have to honour them. My noble friend Lord Adonis, I thought, when he read out the word, and I must say I had not read the words from Chris Pincher, but when he read them out, well, I thought, that is the motion we've got here. I mean, he wants to have a statutory scheme set up. And no one can pay nothing. We make sure that the scheme is going to be in place and protect the victims. That's what the motion does today before the House. So why aren't the government supporting it? I just do not understand. So I very much hope that the Noble Lord will divide will divide the House when we get to the point, if the Noble Lord won't accept the motion, because it really is just not good enough, and the government are going to have to act and protect the victims.
Minister, to reply to the debate, Lord Greenhow.
Well, my lords, it's been an interesting debate, to put it mildly. I would say, I didn't think we'd be invoking the spirit of the European Super League quite so much, but I have to say I stand with all noble lords in being utterly opposed to the proposals, including one of mine, the club that I support. I have to say that I think that the idea that we're unleashing a torrent of issues for leaseholders as a result of the fire safety bill, that was one of the points that the noble Baroness Fox, Lady Fox of Buxley raised, is I think, is, to put it mildly, overstated. It's not something that's going to happen. We recognise that building owners will have to take a proportionate, risk-based approach that takes into account the true possibility of risk to life in properties, and that life risk is mercifully low, as I said in my opening remarks. The reality that is the noble Lord Newby is that the solution has been outlined by the government. We may, and it's quite right, the noble lords can query about the scope, but the solution will always involve three basic elements. The first will be a level of grant funding, and we've had first the ACM fund of some 600 million, and also now the Building Safety Fund of 1 billion. So grant is one element. The next is some kind of financing scheme that provides a loan facility to pay for these works, and finally through tax or levies being the third area of resolution. So the government is proceeding to introduce all three elements, and that is ultimately the only solution that can be offered. I would point out to the noble Lord Adonis that the solution actually in all those areas does not need to be statutory, and in fact in order to be timely cannot be statutory. So the grant funding exists today. The financing scheme, we're going to be publishing further details very shortly, and of course there needs to be Treasury's lead on taxation and levies, as the noble Lord will know. So in response to the noble Baroness Lady Warwick of Undercliff, well, it would be nice to put more money on the table, but over 5 billion, as I'm sure the noble Baroness recognises, is a considerable sum of money, and leasehold properties in those buildings are protected, and we know a number of housing associations that are applying to the Building Safety Fund, and I recognise we can go further and protect the full remediation costs of those buildings, but that is nevertheless the case that many housing associations are applying to the funds for the removal of unsafe cladding. In addition, there's been a very generous affordable housing programme announced of some £12.5 billion that housing associations can access. Just by way of clarification to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, the Building Safety Fund does exist. The money is being accessed. It's quite clear that the additional money that the government has announced will be added to that fund. We're in danger of running out of money, frankly, in a matter of months without the additional amounts mentioned by committed by the government. So that scheme is in existence. It's fair to say that the other things that I mentioned are there to happen, but none of those require statute to implement. So the idea of a statutory solution being the only way forward is simply not the case. I also want to reiterate why these amendments should be rejected. I do believe they are unworkable and impractical, and I will go into some detail. And I have to say I don't have the benefit of political advisors as a Lords Minister, but I'm always happy for extra help in drafting my speeches. But I don't have a special advisor helping me in this regard. And I would say that I just don't think they deliver the solution. All they do is they put the legislation at risk, and we have had Easter recess as one of the reasons why we are now short of time. Now, as noble lords have heard before now, it is impractical and confusing to amend the fire safety order to include this issue. The main aim of the fire safety order is to ensure public safety by reducing the risk to life from fire. This is done through responsible persons complying with their duties and regularly reviewing their fire risk assessment to identify and put in place appropriate fire precautions. These amendments do not include measures that provide public safety or set out how the responsible person should reduce the risk to harm from fire. Instead, they cover the relationship, including financial obligations and liabilities, between freeholder and leaseholder. These are matters that do not sit naturally with the fire safety order, as some noble lords have admitted. Now, if I turn to the noble Earl Lytton's amendment that has been tabled, the noble Earl Lytton wants to add further protections to leaseholders by insisting that building owners seek government support either through our grant or financing schemes before passing costs on to leaseholders. Noble Lords will note that a similar provision already exists in our draft Building Safety Bill, which is in clause 89 at 17p, which places obligations on the landlord to deduct from leaseholder charges any funding received. We are adding to this clause with the purpose of ensuring that building owners must explore other cost recovery mechanisms before passing costs on to leaseholders. In addition to this proposed legislative protection, the existing Building Safety Fund application fund process already requires building owners to demonstrate that they have explored other cost recovery avenues as a condition of government funding. Including this sort of provision in the Building Safety Bill removes a clear practical difficulty in this clause. By extending the requirement to explore alternative funding sources before approaching leaseholders to all building safety risks, leaseholders will now have to work out which costs are directly attributable to the provisions of the Fire Safety Act and which are not. In the interim, building owners should of course already be accessing all the government support available to remediate unsafe cladding, and we are supporting building owners through this process. Now, in response to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, and his amendment, I thank him for his engagement over the course of the last few weeks. And I'm afraid the Right Reverend Prelate's amendment will also not work. The amendment would orphan liability, and we've been down the path of looking either to assign liability to freeholders or orphan liability of works until such time as a statutory scheme is in place that pays for the work directly attributable to this Act. I've already talked about the difficulties of defining which works might be directly attributable to the Fire Safety Bill provisions and which are not. Some of the works that may be required will be low cost, where anyone would reasonably expect leaseholders to pay. Does the Right Reverend Prelate really want to stop the passing on of relatively minor costs, such as that for a new smoke alarm? The amendment does not differentiate between the costs of the work which could lead to delays in important minor works. So we're talking about even stopping something as minor as putting in a smoke alarm as a consequence of this amendment. So no taxpayer scheme for such minor works will be forthcoming, and we reach an entirely avoidable impasse. The amendment also does not take into account of safety defects which are identified outside of the fire risk assessment process. For example, necessary works brought into scope as a result of another incident. In such cases, this will not prevent costs being passed on, and the amendment will not, therefore, achieve what the Right Reverend Prelate intends. My Lords, since this amendment is not sufficiently detailed and will require extensive drafting of primary legislation, it would continue to delay the implementation of the Fire Safety Bill and the important reforms it intends to carry out. Now, we also recognise that there could be protected legal action from building owners to claim for costs they feel they are entitled to pursue from leaseholders. By stating in legislation what the landlord can and cannot recover from the leaseholders, and when it could contradict the provisions set out in the contractual terms of the lease, this would affect the government and, to that extent, taxpayers. The amendment should ultimately be self-defeating, as the pace and progress of all fire safety works would be stalled, still leaving leaseholders in an invidious position. Now, in response to the Baroness Lady Pinnock, I must admit that I have a strong sense of déjà vu. I've seen and reading the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock's amendment. This House will remember an almost identical amendment was laid during the previous stage of this bill and rejected by the Commons. This amendment would orphan liability again, as the previous amendment, and leave leaseholders no better off with no clear route for buildings to be remediated without a clear cost recovery mechanism. Noble Lords will also remember that the scope of this amendment is extremely broad. It's not just applicable to external walls, but but to all and every defect, regardless of whether this has been caused by wear and tear. This is not proportionate and nor appropriate, and it's certainly not the best use of taxpayers' money. The government is focused on supporting the Grenfell Tower public inquiry to uncover the full truth that led to the fire, to ensure the lessons are learnt from this national tragedy. This is in parallel with ongoing work to make homes safer, thoroughly reform the entire regulatory system, and provide redress to the community and to leaseholders. The government is also providing a globally unprecedented package in excess of £5 billion. This is not a minimal sum of money. £5.1 billion is a substantial amount of money to pay to make homes safer from unsafe cladding. It is unclear what a further independent inquiry would deliver. So, my Lords, I ask that noble Lords exercise sound judgment and listen to the will of the democratically elected other place, and recognise that this amendment and others may be based on good intentions, but it's not appropriate or the means that will solve very complex problems. This is the wrong place for this kind of legislation, and in any case, the amendment is likely to be ineffective and possibly risky. It is a big risk, and it's not something to pooh-pooh in answer to the noble Lord Newby, the idea of litigation, because if the litigation does occur, that there is then the risk that not only is that an additional cost in terms of something that the leaseholders potentially face paying for, but then the remediation itself is not carried out. I must emphasise once again that all the solutions that are being put forward are not in any way going to solve this problem, and it's certainly not what the government can support. So I'd like to finish today by reminding noble Lords that the government has provided an unprecedented level of support for leaseholders in excess of £5 billion. And my noble Lords have a choice, and I ask that that choice involves supporting getting this bill onto the statute book and not delaying any further the implementation of this highly important bill that will allow the Grenfell recommendations to be implemented and help make homes safer.
My Lords, I've received a single request to speak after the Minister, so I'm going to call Lord Adonis.
My Lords, insofar as I could tell the detail of the Minister's objection to the Bishop of St Albans amendment, because we're talking about 3 different amendments and it's trying to focus down on the Bishop's amendment, it was that there could be a further delay caused by uncertainty over the attribution of costs, and his objection to the requirement in the Bishop's amendment that the scheme be statutory. Well, on the further delay, of course, that depends on how long it takes the government to come forward with its scheme. The government is in complete control of the timescale. But on the statutory scheme, in order to foster peace and goodwill between the Bishop and the government, might I suggest that if statutory was replaced by government, a government scheme, which need not necessarily be statutory for the reasons that the Minister gave, might this be something that he would be prepared to entertain?
Does the Minister wish to respond?
I'm very new to this place, but the reality is whether we call this, as I've tried to highlight, I do not believe that the solution in large part involves statute. But what the noble Lord Adonis is asking for is for a further commitment that actually really is about putting more government money up front to pay for the significant costs that are faced by leaseholders. So I don't think it is helpful to amend the amendment by removing that one word, because I don't think we can accept the amendment in any way whatsoever. We've set out that we want to focus on the remediation of unsafe cladding, because it is the cladding on the outside of buildings that is the major fire accelerant, and that is what we're going to focus on. And putting forward over £5 billion to do precisely that is a significant, globally unprecedented amount of money, and I don't think amending that one word really moves us any further forward.
With that in mind, I'm going to return to the Lord Bishop of St Albans.
My Lords, I'm hugely grateful for the extraordinary range of speeches that are being made today. And I do want to acknowledge what Her Majesty's Government have done. I take the point that this is unprecedented and a major contribution towards trying to sort out this very difficult problem. And, of course, the Minister also knows that I've said on many occasions I'm terribly naive about all this. I was hoping Her Majesty's Government would come and help solve it, because I'm just an amateur paddling around in the shallows. And I'm hugely grateful for people like the Noble Lord of Lytton, who is a real expert in this area. I still, though, believe my amendment is a practical, helpful, and indeed just way forward, which is in the spirit of what Her Majesty's Government wants and has committed to, and I was hugely grateful for the Noble Lord Adonis for quoting from the Minister in the other place. And I'm still sufficiently positive about our political system, and you'll probably say naive, to believe that actually I think this amendment could well commend itself to people in the other place when they see it is within the spirit of what the government wants to do. I hope that this will be taken back to the other place. They will consider this, or indeed the government themselves will wish to introduce something like this, which will help us move this forward, and let's get this onto the statute book as quickly as possible. That's what I'd like to do. But in the light of what I heard, with reluctance, I do feel I have no other choice, though, to divide the House on this motion.
The question is